Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for our webinar covering payments megatrends in the United States for 2026 and 2027. My name is Abed Delgado. I'm Digital Marketing Director for PCMI, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. So before we get started, just a quick overview of what to expect. We're going to be having about a 50-minute or so presentation, and then after that, we'll have about 10 minutes or so reserved for Q&A. You can ask questions at any point in time in the webinar. Those of you who are Zoom veterans already know this, but for those of you that are not 100% familiar, if you look at your participant panel, you'll see an icon there that says Q&A. You click on it at any point in time that you have a question to pose to our panel, and then it'll bring up a window. You write in your question, we'll get it, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the session. So that should do it for that basic aspect of it. Right here, you're seeing our legal notice. I'm not going to read it in detail because we really want to get to the material, but you can look at that at your leisure, and it covers our sense of responsibilities and the process and so on and so forth, whatever lawyers like to mention. And then this is going to be our speaker panel. They're going to be introducing themselves one at a time, but this just gives you a quick look at who's going to be speaking today. And now we want to get started. So I want to turn the floor over to Lindsay Lear to start guiding us through these megatrends. Lindsay.
Thank you, Abel. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. My name is Lindsay Lear. I'm the Managing Director of PCMI. And every year, for about 5 years now, we have launched our annual Megatrends event in which we bring you our take on the primary events shaping the payments industry. Each year, we've done it a little bit differently. And this year, I really love our approach. We are covering 3 regions this year: Latin America, the United States, and Asia Pacific, selecting 5 major trends that are playing out globally and then tracking how each of those trends are manifesting in each respective region and how advanced or mature those trends are. So many of you may have caught our Latin America webinar yesterday, which was really fascinating, and our Asia Pacific event will be coming up on March 10th. And today we'll be diving into the United States, which massive market in and of itself. We have plenty of content to cover just in this one country. So what are we going to be talking about today? Okay, multi-rail world, the battle for microtransactions intensifies. AI becoming the gateway to commerce, cross-border and its fragmentation and intra-regional flows. The great acquiring unbundle, or what we might call the emergence of acceptance ecosystems, and B2B payment modernization and strategization, which is a word I believe we invented, but is really referring to converting B2B payments and treasury into a actual business strategy. So we'll get into that in detail in this session. Okay, so before we actually dive into our trends, I wanted to update you all on how we are thinking about payment trends. Why is this important? Every year we deliver a lot of content, data, insights, predictions, and projections, which our clients get a lot of value out of. However, we don't stop there. Our academic analysis adds value up to a certain point. But then we want to help companies actually use that information to make key decisions and achieve important business outcomes. And so the way we think about this is, in the payments industry, any kind of executive is making decisions for their business. Those decisions are probably going to be oriented around one of these 6 objectives. Of course, there are variations and overlaps, but this kind of covers the strategic decisions and objectives that clients need to make, right? You might be trying to own the user experience and create a product flywheel. You might want to be the rail in which your goal is going to be increased volume or share of wallet. Controlling the economics is related to protecting margins, lowering costs, and optimizing performance. You may be an enabler and you're looking to embed in the right growth ecosystems, and that's really about partnerships and distributions. If you're looking to add value beyond payments, payment adjacent, you're probably looking to enable high value workflows. And almost everyone is looking to optimize and manage risk, whether that be fraud related, operational risk, or regulatory risk. So we know that these are the objectives clients are looking for. And so to really serve clients at the highest level, we've abstracted these out even a level further and narrowed them down into 3 categories, which is how we organize our analytical solutions. The first one being grow, which roughly corresponds to these 4 outcomes. Next being measure, which is going to correspond to these outcomes here. And then finally, protect, which is really about competitive threat or regulatory threat and managing and optimizing how you're performing in the business. So grow, measure, protect is something you're going to hear from us on a regular basis. And to help guide us in how we help clients get to those objectives of grow, measure, protect, we also map what are clients' strategic intentions. So if we go one more step forward, we see that these 6 outcomes and grow, measure, protect also map to these high level strategic outcomes, right? Am I trying to own something in the business? Am I trying to enable the business, or am I trying to optimize in the business? So throughout our presentation today, we are going to present what we see going on as trends in the industry and then dial that down into the strategic implications and the questions that you need to have answered in order to be successful. All right. So hopefully you will find some value in this today, and it will increase your understanding not only of the trend, but how it's impacting your business. Okay. So let's go ahead and get forward. I'm going to invite Lautaro to begin taking us through multi-rail in the US, which that's not something we always think about in the US, a very car dominated market. But as Lau will tell us, there's a lot of interesting things we need to be paying attention to. So Lautaro, welcome.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Lynn. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. So let's start with the idea behind multi-rail. For a very long time, we talked about payments like it was mainly cars versus cash. But if we look closely at the US today, we will see that actually there is a portfolio of rails that coexist, but compete at the micro level. But before we can understand that, which rail wins in each use case and why, let's have a quick look at the US landscape. So as Lindsay just mentioned, when we look at the payments in the US, we think about cards. But really, we're looking at one of the most digitized economies in the world, very high bank account penetration, over 90%. And as a result, extremely high card penetration and use. If we look at the right of the slide, we see that credit and debit are growing at around 6% annually. Which is very solid growth if we think and account for how mature the sector is. However, at the same time, we are actually seeing a lot of growth in A2A. And most interestingly, if we look at Zelle, we're seeing about 20% growth, and Venmo around 13%, which I guess if you compare it to markets like Latin America and APAC, it might not look like very high growth for an emerging payment method, but we've got to think that they're still outpacing card growth. Then we've got R2P and FedNow, very different payment systems, but they are scaling from smaller bases, so that's something that's quite noteworthy. And then what about cash? So cash, it's still a part of the story. In fact, the Fed's consumer payments data had cash at about 16% in 2023. And, well, it's been declining since. It really hasn't disappeared. So we estimate it's probably sitting somewhere around the low teens. But I think, something very interesting about the US is that we're still going to talk about financial inclusion. And we're going to talk about financial inclusion not from the same perspective that we do in APAC and in Latin America, but given it's a digitized market, we've got to think of financial inclusion as, quality of access, credit availability, and costs. So if we take a step back and we look at the data, what is it telling us? Well, it's telling us that, it's a market that is not constrained by infrastructure. And actually, it's a market that's defined by rail optionality. So for merchants and providers, the question then becomes which rail is optimal for cost, speed, control, and customer experience. So if we go to the next slide. Great. Like Lindsay mentioned, when we talk about the US, we think about, a card-dominated market, and that is true in many, many retail contexts. But I think if we just stick with that, we're missing the bigger picture. So what we're seeing now in A2A, it's that A2A is becoming more structured. And as a result, we're seeing different schemes specialized by use case and even by tax treatment. So Zelle is probably the clearest example. Last year, it grew about 20%, facilitated 1.2 trillion in payments, and now it's reaching close to 100 million bank and credit union accounts. But, For the payments side, what's really important and that we should notice is that about a third of that volume is tied to small business payments, which shows that Zelle is not only, it's evolving from just a P2P system, and, it's becoming default for many, many small businesses in the US. And I guess one of the keys for Zelle's success, it's tax treatment. So the IRS has clarified that Zelle does not report transactions in the same way as Venmo and Cash App are required to, essentially because it isn't a wallet holding funds. It's essentially a bank-to-bank service. And while that income still needs to be reported, we think that the absence of automatic reporting, changes behavior at the margin. So yeah, Zelle has gained, a lot of traction in what we call the digital but informal economy. So again, think home services, think construction, beauty, wellness, freelancing, really any kind of service where speed, cost avoidance, and low friction, matter a lot. So if you combine that with card surcharging, and the structural decline in cash a check, you've got a winner. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So again, on A2A, but the other side of the spectrum, we've got the digital wallet. So Venmo, Cash App, totally different business model. While Zelle is embedded inside banking, Venmo and Cash App are building ecosystems. And if we think about, what the ambition of an ecosystem is, it's not just the money movement, right? These apps are looking to become essentially the operating system for a segment of consumers. If we double click on Venmo, they're increasingly positioning themselves as a commerce app anchored in convenience and rewards. And, they're doing a lot of aggressive cashback, loyalty mechanics. They've got Venmo Stash going on. And, loads of offers at very select merchants. So I guess here the ultimate goal is not just the transfers, but just to increase the frequency of use at the point of sale. On the other hand, you've got Cash App, which has more of a broad approach. Basically, they're looking to brand themselves as, an alternative to traditional banking, especially focusing on younger and lower income users. And they've built an app, starting off P2P payments, but now they're doing deposits, they're doing debit cards, they're doing buy now, pay later, they're doing investments, even tax services and digital assets as well. So yeah, while both Venmo and Cash App have been successful, they still only represent around 5% of POS volume, which, it's still very, very small compared to cards, but they've done well to position themselves in high frequency categories like retailing and food. So now if we take a step back and look at the chart on the left, I don't think it's we shouldn't be asking ourselves if A2A is going to grow because it is already growing. So I think the best question is to think about where each rail will consolidate by use and how that monetization will play out. So if we look at the chart on the left, we will see that the POS slash e-com, cards have a decisive advantage. And we all know the story, the university accepted, frictionless embedded checkout, the dispute framework works, the user experience just mature. And of course, there's the rewards side to it. Venmo and Cash App are, getting some incremental progress, but it's still, nowhere near the dominance of cards. And Zelle essentially is out of the race because, it wasn't designed for merchant acceptance. But if we look at service providers now, the picture flips. Zelle is very strong. Again, when it comes to paying a contractor, a beautician, it's bank linked, it's simple, it's got the tax treatment advantage. Venmo and Cash App compete here as well, but again, they lack that sort of formal status that makes them, professional enough for payments. Now, if we look at small business, again, Zelle and cards are the strongest because, many small businesses, accept cards, but, increasingly to avoid fees, they are exploring Zelle. And again, Cash App and Venmo are still not serious enough for that kind of transactions. And then for P2P, we have Zelle, Cash App, and Venmo. They're all competing evenly across the board. So now if we look at the right, and if we, what we've just discussed, if we map it by monetization and formality, I think we get really cool insights. And I think the four key insights we get are that formal merchant acceptance, it's the easiest to monetize, and that's where cards dominate with MDR economics. Zelle sits on the opposite side, so huge scale, but monetized more indirectly through bank relationships. And then Venmo and Cash App kind of sit in the middle. They can monetize more directly because they're wallets and they're building an ecosystem and can charge an MDR. But I think the great insight here is that digital informality zone. So we're talking about commercial transactions that happen digitally, but the service might be delivered in the physical world, and payments are still not fully embedded into merchant infrastructure. And actually it starts looking a lot like emerging markets, so service flows, micro business, less automated reporting. So yeah, I think that the key takeaway for this section is that talks should be framed more around use case specialization and not rail displacement. And really that's the multi-rail picture. Cards, a win, what we can call formal trading. A2A expands where it's cheaper and just simple, and wallets are trying to bridge both. So Lynn, back to you.
Fabulous. That was a great rundown, Lau. I loved your description there. And so, what do we make of this as practitioners and executives in the business? Basically, the key question we want all of you to be thinking about is, what are the implications of alternative payment method growth in a card dominant market like the US? This is something that probably most of us didn't expect to happen. Is it a volume opportunity or is it a cannibalization risk? And the answer to that question will depend who you are in the industry. But to make any kind of decision or actionable roadmap, again, the first thing companies need to do is figure out, what is my strategic intention? Am I trying to own, enable, or optimize? Once you have your strategic posture defined, then you need to know, what are the options available to me? And here are just some options that are available depending on what you're trying to achieve. Are you an institution or one of these ecosystems and you're trying to own the customer, own deposits, own account primacy? Are you an enabler, and what you might need to do is, how do I enable multi-rail access for merchants? How do I provide orchestration and data visibility? Or am I in a more defensive position and I want to optimize my position, optimize my economics? These are the variety of options that might be available to you. And when you're thinking about these strategic decisions, we want you to think about how PCMI as a partner can help you do that, whereas we might be able to help accelerate this decision making. You can go ahead and put up the next box there. Through figuring out, how do I, as an institution, how do I utilize fast payment rails to maximize deposits, achieve that account primacy, and actually move into lending? How do I forecast payment method mix down the road, and how this is going to impact my economics and my profit margins, and my ability to operate? How, as a merchant, can I optimize acceptance across these different rails and partnerships in the ecosystem? So these are the types of questions and decisions that PCMI is perfectly positioned to help you make, accelerate, integrate, and implement. Okay, so thank you very much. We will move on to a very fascinating discussion about AI, and I will invite Fernanda to take us through this trend.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. So yeah, about AI trends, so AI becoming the gateway to commerce. We would like to start, next slide, please. We would like to start off by plotting this maturity curve of consumer AI-enabled shopping. And just note that here we are talking about AI-enabled and not agentic commerce, because agentic commerce ultimately means that the entire shopping process is fully automated. And actually, we are not that yet, right? So it's fully autonomous by an AI agent, and we are not there yet. We have a couple of stages to get there. And if we look here at this map of the US, we can start with phase one, right? So phase one is where most consumers in the world and in the US are today. So we have AI assisted discovery. So here is where consumers use ChatGPT or any AI interface to search for products. It's in a more exploratory way, but ultimately the payment takes place on the merchant website. Okay, so this is phase one. However, in the US, the industry has laid the groundwork for phase two, which is AI embedded checkout. So in this phase, actually, the consumers complete the purchase inside the AI interfaces, right? So we have a payment processor and a PSP there, but however, you still need to confirm each transaction as you would in any e-commerce flow, right? And here we have, like Stripe is enabling, Shopify, PayPal, and we also brought a couple of merchants that are enabling these payments within AI interfaces, right? So it's not all the US, it's not every merchant. So it's very important to mention that we think it's about 10% of the merchants that are already offering this type of feature, right? And then you have phase three, which is actually the agentic commerce, right? So here is where AI monitors preference, inventory, and prices, and they actually do the transactions autonomously, right? It's based on certain guardrails that the consumer has to set up, but they are budgeting and choosing the payment method autonomously. So that is agentic commerce, and that is still conceptual, not in deployment yet, but we are building towards that capability, okay? So now let's go and take a look a little bit more in depth for phase two. Abel, if you can move to the next one. So I don't know how many of you have actually experienced this flow, but I'm assuming that most of you are still very unfamiliar with this. So let's go through it together. So let's take an example of a ChatGPT or OpenAI and thinking that I'm looking for a product, right? So next slide. So here I'm looking for some picture frames, right? So give me some options of picture frames, and then these two options pops up. So we have here Wood Salon, which looks like it's a local vendor. And then we also have Etsy. And if you notice here in Etsy option, I have the buy button inside the AI interface, right? So I can buy directly from ChatGPT. Similarly, if you use Google Gemini, and for example, I'm looking for some office chair here in Wayfair. I also have the buy option inside the AI chat, right? So that's not really a revolution. This is just a type of marketplace shopping, embedded commerce in external environments. This has been existing before ChatGPT, but what is really interesting is what happened next, right? So it's when you click buy. So when in this example here in Etsy, for example, when Lindsay clicked at buy, her payment information were all pre-filled. And that's not because she went in ChatGPT and put all her data, all her cards. No, that is pre-filled by an identity layer. And that identity layer can be Stripe Link, Shopee Pay, Google Wallet, Apple Pay. Those are all potential identity layers. And they are responsible to manage all this saved payment credential, connect to her email or other alias, right? And here, if we can see here in the bottom, we have link. So that we can also infer that here, probably this transaction is backed by Stripe Link, right? And actually Stripe has been one of the PSPs that have been vocally enabling AI payments within AI platforms, right? So next slide. Cool. So now let's take a look of this new flow to understand a little bit of the players, right? So we have the AI chat app, which in this case is ChatGTP, and that is responsible for the user interface. But then we also have the checkout surface owner, which now is open in this example is OpenAI embedded checkout, and it's responsible for the orchestration and ultimately the wallet selection that funds that transaction. Next, we have the identity wallet. So the identity layer that is triggered by the email address logged into ChatGPT, right? And here, as we saw in the previous example, most like Stripe Link. And what's the role here? The role is store card tokens, manage email, manage addresses, and payment conditions, right? And finally, we have the PSP acquirer in the back scenes, which can be Stripe, for example, that retrieves network token, do the authorization and the settle. But the thing is, who is making money in this transaction, right? And how that differs from a normally, usually flow that we are used to. So we have the PSP and the acquirer, and they take their normal fee as they would in any flow. But here we also have OpenAI taking a piece of the pie, right? And interestingly, Identity Wallet has not charged a fee by itself. It has just been used as a customer acquisition tool to navigate into new verticals. But OpenAI or AI interfaces, they are actually taking a piece of this transaction. So if we move forward to the next slide. Yeah, so what will be the future of AI checkout platforms? Well, that ultimately depends on consumer adoption, right? And industry readiness. But the way we want to think about it is that is the way that big techs are definitely getting a slice of commerce, right? So far, they are trying to get a little bit through wallets, but actually they haven't yet had made an overly aggressive move towards commerce. But now they are providing a capability that nobody else can, and they are embedding themselves in this new commerce flow, right? But of course, ultimately, that will depend on consumer adoption. So let's just take a look at these stats here. We have a bunch of consumer surveys about AI adoption. So we have that 61% of Americans used AI in the past 6 months. 57% have used AI for shopping, 23% have used in the last month, but only 5% have made a native AI chat purchase. And that translates to 1% of total merchant traffic. So that means that we are in very early stage here. I think it's safe to say that AI native purchase will become a thing in the future. However, what is unknown and unclear is the autonomous portion, right? So do consumers really want to delegate financial decisions to AI agents? And if so, what use cases, right? So that's where the answer is still widely speculative. Lindsay, back to you.
Great, fair. Thank you for that walkthrough. This was a really fun part of the content to build because really breaking down this flow and understanding how this actually works. And I'm curious as to all of you if you've seen this in real life, if you've made a purchase, and how much is this really affecting you? Because I believe of course, this topic has created enormous buzz in the industry, and it's potentially extremely disruptive, possibly the greatest disruption that we will have experienced so far in the industry. But to Farah's point, it really matters. Do consumers want agentic commerce? And I personally am not convinced that they do. So the question we want to pose is, how quickly will AI shift from a discovery tool to a primary checkout channel? And even then, to full autonomous commerce. So how fast will it shift, and in which categories? This is the question that companies really need to be looking at and getting prepared for. So in order to know how to place my bets and how to make the correct partnerships and investments. So depending on if you're looking to own the user experience, the checkout platform, identity, data, are you trying to enable the integrations? There's already some very successful first movers in this category. Or am I looking to optimize? It's going to impact what your available options are, and where we really believe we can play a valuable role in your decision making here is forecasting where AI commerce will scale first and guide your investment sequencing. Because if you make an incorrect bet here, it could be very, very costly. More long term is, to Fernanda's point, assessing the strategic impact of big tech platform control. And here I just want to go to a quick audience question, which was terrific here. Are you seeing any understanding, or to what extent will there be systemic risk? To what extent is systemic risk changing as a result of AI in the multi-moneyverse? And this is a great question, because one potential impact of AI-enabled commerce is eventual constant market concentration, first among big tech players and LLM providers and cloud providers. And secondly, even among merchants who successfully navigate marketing and product placement within chat apps. So I don't know if we have an answer right now as to what extent that systemic shift is changing, but it is changing in the sense that prior to now, it really banks and networks were behind the potential systemic risk, and that is potentially shifting to a very consolidated number of technology players. So that is something to really think about carefully and potentially forecast and quantify. What does this risk look like, and what are my mitigation strategies? And then finally, designing competitive positioning and go-to-market strategies to counter this consolidation. This is where merchants want to be thinking, how do I compete when my marketing and visibility strategy is completely disrupted through AI? So, this is something to really think carefully about, but at the same time, not overemphasize, because this is all speculative as to how fast it will move based on actual consumer demand. So something to really analyze carefully. All right. Thank you, Fernanda. Let's move in to our cross-border section, our cross-border analysis. And I'm going to walk us through this. We've done an extensive body of work on cross-border payments globally and in the US in the past year. And the global title of this trend is Growing Intraregional Flows. Of course, that doesn't necessarily make sense for the United States, which is one massive market, but we are seeing fragmentation that we want to observe. So going ahead, just to get some numbers down, US is a massive market. Whenever we're looking at numbers, market size, it's a different scale from other parts of the world. We have $90 billion in outbound P2P remittances, a very large market in and of itself. We have $5 trillion in outbound B2B payments or trade. We're excluding from this institutional payments and wholesale type payments, really invoice payments from B2B, from businesses making, importing goods and services. So right now, about 80% of this volume is conducted via SWIFT. We've already seen decent fragmentation in the P2P realm, where banks, card rails, even blockchain are competing rather aggressively. In the B2B world, that fragmentation is much less pronounced, where SWIFT is still highly dominant, although this is, of course, where there is plenty of room for disruption, and a lot of players are going after this piece of the pie specifically. Okay, going ahead, what we want to call our attention to here is that as cross-border continues to digitize and fragment around the world, it's doing so along three kind of corridors, or according to three rails. And we presented about a month ago in our cross-border webinar for Latin America, but these principles really hold true globally. And there's kind of three integration models that we're seeing. One is around digital wallets and digital rails. And so, the card networks have been quite successful with this strategy so far. Almost every week we hear about a new partnership they're striking with different wallets and rail aggregators around the world. And as local payment apps scale in the US, there is the potential for growing partnerships between these from the US outbound. Okay, a second rail that can help us achieve integration in cross-border payments is, of course, stablecoin. And with the Genius Act being passed, this has given banks the confidence to play more proactively and businesses to more confidently mint their own private stablecoin, which we've seen happening proliferation of that occurring. And increasingly, these two rails are intermingling. So not only wallets making partnerships with network push payment rails, but also with stablecoins and with networks being those on and off rails for stablecoins. So increasingly, we're seeing integration of these two rails together. A third version is the interlinking of domestic RTP rails, which we have not seen take root in the US yet. It's quite advanced in Asia Pacific, a little bit speculative in Latin America, and even more speculative in the United States. But as these rails scale and become more integrated in the domestic market, it begs the question, could these be rails to facilitate cross-border payments as well? Okay, moving ahead. I mentioned that giant B2B opportunity, and what we notice this is really where technology and disruption is moving very quickly. And what we observe is that B2B payments represent this blue ocean of opportunity, and there's very little differentiation. It's difficult for companies to differentiate and declare and be able to articulate to the market where they sit in that opportunity and which use cases, which corridors, which partnerships, which currencies they are best suited for. And so one very, very pressing opportunity is to more effectively differentiate and articulate a value proposition as these different players move into B2B cross-border payments. Okay. And if we go to the next slide, the trend that I want to, or the possibility that I want to propose here is that these paradigms that I just described that are taking place globally are not yet very aggressively taking place in the US, because cross-border payments, even though they are quite expensive and have all of the misgivings of cross-border payments, they're working effectively. And the US is such a massive market and quite concentrated market today. But what I anticipate happening is that as fast payments scale domestically, this is going to actually change a paradigm in how cross-border takes place in the US. And it could happen in one of three ways. Again, utilizing card rails, utilizing the card rail wallet partnership. However, another very interesting thing to look at is what Zelle is going to do. Zelle, as you saw at the beginning, is the fastest growing consumer-oriented A2A scheme, growing 20% per year. And as that becomes more and more important, banks are seeing an opportunity to play more aggressively in low-value cross-border. And Zelle made an announcement, early warning sign made an announcement at the end of last year that Zelle would integrate stablecoin to enable cross-border payments. There's not that much information available about that. It's still kind of speculative as to how this will work and when that will become a reality. But the hypothesis here is that as fast payments scale in the US and as retail A2A payments scale in the US, that's going to be a bridge. Whatever scales faster is going to be a bridge to outbound payments in a cross-border fashion as well. It also brings up an interesting possibility for FedNow and real-time payments from the clearinghouse, because these guys are based on the ISO 222 standard, which is compatible with other domestic schemes like PIX, like Project Nexus, etc. So kind of the question that I'm asking is, how is the scaling of domestic RTP going to impact cross-border, and which standard will be used ultimately to create interoperability with the rest of the world in competition with SWIFT? Okay, so those are kind of the major questions that we're looking at and that we want to encourage our audience to be asking. So on the next slide, here we can kind of dial this down into one critical question, which is, as domestic real-time payments scale in the US, which ecosystem will define the future of cross-border? So depending on if you're owning, enabling, or optimize, you may have a series of options available to you. And PCMI's work in cross-border payments positions us very well to be a guide in how to strategize here. So, helping to prioritize corridors based on obtainable volume increase your sales team's ROI in this blue ocean of opportunity and actually get more bang for your buck out of sales and marketing activities. Identifying ecosystem partnerships, and develop a phased cross-border expansion are all things that we can support with as this environment gets increasingly chaotic. All right. So thank you for that. We will move into a discussion around acquiring. So I will have the team come back on to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. So great. Let's now switch to acceptance and specifically to what we call the great unbundling. So Abel, next slide, please. Yeah, so when defining the acquiring unbundling, here I guess the core point is that acquiring is no longer a linear model. Now it's a model with many modules. So we're talking, it's a layered stack with orchestration, fraud, risk, embedded finance, vertical SaaS integrations, and loads of other value-added services, sitting around the acquiring core. And actually, we came across a McKinsey article asking whether acquirers could remain relevant as independent software vendors disrupted payments. And actually, we think that in the US, that framing feels a bit overstated because when we really think about it, acquirers, remain structurally dominant because they control, what's hardest to replace. So, we're talking about network connectivity, sponsor bank relationships, underwriting, settlement infrastructure. But what we really see that has shifted is the control of merchant interface. So ISVs increasingly own the software workflow, and with it, they influence routing decisions and service adoption. But in most cases, they're still sitting on top of a enabling acquirer. So next slide, please. So yeah, just to understand roughly how the market is organizing around this shift, again, US card volume, massive scale, 10 trillion in 2025. But if we look at the volumes and actually Visa and MasterCard acquiring volume in the US, the volume has consolidated rather than fragmented. And when we look at the top acquirers, so the ones with over 100 billion in processing value, there was a major consolidation in the early 2000s up until around 2020. And right then we saw a leveling off of the market. So it's not accurate to say that acquirers are losing relevance. At the infrastructure level, like I mentioned before, the network connectivity, the settlement, risk management, sponsorship, that market still remains controlled by a small number of dominant players. But what has expanded, though, I guess it's the layer above the acquirer. So, we're talking of large ecosystem of payment facilitators, ISOs, sub-acquirers, merchant service providers, anyone really distributing acquiring capabilities. In Latin America, we would often describe these as resellers or aggregators. So essentially anyone adding a bit of specialization at the front end. But again, they still rely on a concentrated set of core acquirers underneath. So for this slide, the key takeaway is that distribution has diversified, but the acquiring backbone remains consolidating. So next slide. Like we said, the acquiring backbone remains concentrated, but acceptance has become software-led and verticalized. So actually, for most merchants, payments is no longer something they shop for directly. It's actually something they kind of stumble upon. It's something they adopt indirectly when they choose a software provider. And that's actually really relevant for the economics, because if we consider about 2/3 of acquiring revenue comes from small business, and that's exactly the segment that, increasingly buys, an operating system for the business, not a standalone processor. So next slide, please. Yeah, so very quickly here, the economics are changing and we have two key models. So the first one is the referral model. Here, the acquirer owns a merchant relationship. They share the economics with the ISV for distribution and implementation. For the SMB, the price typically stays the same, but the acquirer gives a bit of margin just to win scale. Then we've got the embedded model. And that's slightly different. Now, the ISV owns the merchant, they set the pricing, they negotiate rates with the acquirer, and naturally they add a bit of markup at the end. So for the SMB, it can be slightly more expensive because they're paying for the convenience of integrated software and embedded payments. And for the acquirer, they lose a bit of control of the economics. Meaning they have a lower take rate, less pricing control, and less direct visibility. But overall, the result is both. It's the same for both models. So essentially, acquirers gain volume growth, but they face a declining share of revenue per merchant, and margins just tighten. So next slide, please. Yeah. So by now, I think it's pretty clear that distribution has changed dramatically, but acquirers are still relevant underneath. So there's a quote here that I think really captures it well. So software companies are becoming the primary distributors of payments and merchant accounts in their verticals, owning more of the economics while improving user experience and retention. So yeah, looking at the right, you will see some of the big names in embedded payments, and you will also see the mature verticals where vertical SaaS dominates currently. So restaurants, healthcare, fitness. But then you will also see the opportunity verticals. So here we're talking about verticals that are less digitized in general, and here is software is key because it provides greater efficiency both at the operational level and the billing level. So essentially, all this really encapsulates what the acquiring unbundling is. So same backbone, new distribution, and the economics moving upward towards the software layer. So back to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Lau. This, if we kind of analyze this from a strategic positioning, it really goes back to first principles. This is about, from an acquirer's perspective, do I sacrifice direct relationship to get more volume and expand the payment pie and let the ecosystem develop along digital capabilities? And this is about, weighing competitive threat versus being able to see long-term overall volume expansion. This is taking place in every market around the world to varying degrees, and it's at this point in the US quite advanced. So the question that we want our clients to be thinking about is, okay, we're in a software-led shift. We're in an era of embedded payments that has been proven. Where should we seek to maintain ownership of the merchant? Where should we partner? And where should we go ahead and accept compress margins at lower pricing in order to gain access to greater volume? And how does that change our overall thinking about the business? So if you're if you're an acquirer or a PSP and you're owning that merchant relationship, there are certain options that are available to you. If you are a technology provider, you might be really looking to power with ISVs. Who are the ISVs who are moving the needle, in which verticals, in which use cases, providing orchestration, integrating, figuring out which vertical ecosystems are growing the fastest and are best suited to your business. Or if you're optimizing for cost, for margin, for that embedded mix. Where PCMI comes into play here is helping you define what is that winning role in a software-led ecosystem. Many financial institutions feel out of the water with this question, and so we can help you figure out where you best fit to win long-term. Building vertical growth strategies that actually scale according to how fast-moving emerging industries might be. And then, identifying the next generation of embedded payment enablers. This is a constantly evolving cascade of players. And so who are the next generation of players who are going to be part of that acceptance value chain? Where do you want to partner with them for your maximum benefit? All right. So thank you very much. We will move on to our final trend here, and I will invite Fernanda back to take us through B2B modernization.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, so about B2B payments modernization, I think it's important for us to start just showing how the payment mix has evolved in the last 6-7 years. So if we can see here, in 2019, checks and cash was about 50% of the market. And that's actually a little bit funny because check is heavily used in the US, and that's not the case in most of the countries. So we can see here that in 2019, it was about 50% of the market. And then how this has been evolved in the years. So in 2024, this number has down to 32%. And where did the volume go? So not that much to cards or wire, but much more to ACH. So what we have seen here in the US is a digitization trend, actually more like a electronification trend rather than digitization, right? So we see that cards are quite stable, wire too, and the biggest volume shift from check and cash to ACH. And next slide, please. And one of the innovations in B2B that are proven to be most influential is virtual cards, right? So virtual cards are leading the way in commercial card spend. So if we look here in this green mountains, right, we can see that virtual cards has been growing since 2022. And the reason here are varied, right? So virtual cards can be issued on demand for a specific purchase. And that, of course, adds extra security and flexibility layer. However, virtual cards can also have some economic benefits, right? Because very often corporates act as co-branded issuers in partnerships with banks. And that allows them to share the interchange revenue generated on supply payments. So that means that they are turning accounts payable into revenue streams. So by shifting money away from ACH and checks through virtual cards, they're actually generating some incremental income. Next slide, please. And one of the most fascinating changes that we're seeing in B2B payments in the US is actually the expanding role of Treasury. So traditionally, Treasury cash management has been thought of us as very operational roles, right? But they have been increasingly invited to opine on strategy. So if we see here, 80% of treasuries say the KPIs have expanded in scope over the past 5 years, and 50 to 70% are now joining regular discussions about corporate performance, geographic expansion, digital transformation. So that means that once your core treasury is digitized, it means that you have much better access to data, better visibility on money movement and cash standings. And that allows you to become a strategic influencer in the business, right? And next slide. And another big transformation here is API connectivity. So 74% of treasurers will be using APIs by 2026, well, this year. And that signals a move from traditional batch files transfers to more real-time and fully integrated infrastructure, right? So if we look here in this chart where we have the demand for API, especially the currently using or implementing, which is the red portion, we can see how much that has been grown over time. And by this year, we'll have more than 50% of treasuries using APIs. And here we actually have a nice quote that help us to understand the idea behind this. So APIs can act as a bridge, creating an opportunity to leapfrog competitors by digitalizing and transforming the treasury function and pushing business growth to new levels. Next one. Okay, so this slide really captures what we think is the major shift in B2B payments, right? So Treasury now is moving away from being cost center to actually become value generator, right? So as I mentioned, historically, we associate Treasury with operational KPIs, liquidity management, risk mitigation, and success ultimately meant cost reduction, right? So minimizing cost. But that has been evolving. And now treasury teams are actually generating value across the organization through these three primary levers here. So first one is virtual cards. As we just mentioned, we are able to monetize accounts payables with virtual cards, right? The second one is dynamic discounting. So when treasury access liquidity, they can deploy that capital to pay suppliers early in exchange for discounts. And the third one is supply chain finance. So corporates, they can extend their payment terms, enabling suppliers to get paid early through banks or third-party financing, right? And all that supports this is digitalization and real-time visibility, right? So when treasury systems become more API connected, more integrated with ERPs and banking platforms, we can see the cash management role being evolved to real-time treasury. So what we have seen here is actually that movement from cash management through strategic advisor to real-time treasury. And what ultimately means that treasury now is not about just safeguarding capital, right? It's much more about how to optimize it, to monetize it, to help business growth, and also find a competitive advantage. Lynn, with you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I love this trend because it is potentially the hardest one to tackle. And, corporates really need our help here. Corporates need guidance and advisory from the payments industry. Remember, payments is not their business. They're busy running their own corporations across a multitude of different industries. So the question to be asking ourselves is, how do we enable corporates to extract more strategic value from treasury while accelerating API and digital payment adoption? They need a very clear roadmap. They need guidance in prioritization. They need to understand what's the ROI for disrupting all of my systems. And so banks certainly have a role to play here. Technology enablers certainly have a role to play here. And rails and networks absolutely have a role to play here. So where PCMI can have a very influential role is helping to identify the highest digital conversion payable segments. Again, it's about that prioritization. Where do we see this moving the fastest? What is the low-hanging fruit? Designing supplier enablement and monetization strategies. One of the most powerful things the payments industry can do for corporations is help them convert a cost center into a revenue stream through virtual cards, through financing, and actually optimize the cash that they have in their coffers. And then finally, helping to incubate or identify and then incubate a B2B digitization ecosystem through fintech partnerships and through technology provider partnerships. We've seen digitization in the payments industry occur over and over thanks to these partnerships and ecosystem plays. And this is a very nascent, very immature segment. So helping figure out how to enable that is a place where we can add real value. Okay, so I want to thank everyone. We're just at time, but I'm going to wrap up very quickly with a couple of summary slides so you guys can, your heads probably are spinning at this point, but we want to just dial things in here. Oops, I'm sorry, that's the wrong side. Keep going. Let's go to the next one. There we go. So this is where we kind of compare our three regions and think about how mature each of these 5 stories are across the world. And where we can see is that the U.S. is certainly, as Lau said at the beginning of the presentation, one of the most digitized payments environments in the world, and yet also not at the same time, due to legacy frameworks that work well enough still to have been able to have avoided significant digital disruption. So we find the USA to be behind Asia Pacific in most cases and ahead of Latin America in most cases. But again, each market behaves uniquely, and it's very important to have a really dialed in strategy for each market that we're considering. Okay, and so if we go to our final slide here, just want to remind us all of the 5 strategic questions we want you to have top of mind as you're operating in the US. So really quickly, what are the implications of alternative payment method growth in a card dominant market? And what do I do about that? How quickly will AI shift from discovery to a primary checkout channel, and in which categories first? And how do I invest to prepare for that? As real-time payments scale in the US, which ecosystem, which rail, which set of standards is going to define the future of outbound cross-border? In a software-led shift toward embedded payments and acceptance, where should we own the merchant and where should we play in this evolving value chain? And then finally, how do we as an industry enable corporates to extract more value from treasury and cash management while helping them to digitize their operations? These are big questions. These are very exciting questions. These are questions we would love to help you with. And we have a couple of questions, but we are over time. So I'm just going to wrap us up. We're going to follow up with those, with you guys who wrote questions in, which a couple of them are really interesting. So thank you for that. But I don't want to take any more time. So let's go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Fernanda, and thank you, Lautaro, and the whole team who helped to put this together. And to close, I just want to remind all of you who are on the line that we are here as your partners to make the best decisions possible and help you get to your goals faster, more efficiently, with less headache. This stuff is hard. This industry is changing so quickly and probably outside the scope of any of our individual realm of expertise. And so we're here to help you meet your KPIs, look good in front of your boss, and help you advance your entire company's mission faster than you would on your own. So please count on us. We really want to have some one-on-ones with you to hear how you're reacting to this content and hear how we might be able to help you advance this year. So we will follow up with you. Thank you very much for participating, and join us on March 10th for a discussion of Asia Pacific. Take care, everyone. Thank you.